Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the first of the 2025 full semester seminar series presentations hosted by the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for Hellenic Studies at Simon Fraser University. I'm Dimitris Krallis. I teach at the Department of Global Humanities, and I'm a member of the SNF Center, and will be moderating, to the degree that moderation is necessary, today's talk. Now, before we begin, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that this event is taking place at Simon Fraser University on Burnaby Mountain on the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Coquitlam peoples. So, I'm delighted to present today's speaker, Dr. Anaren Ellis-Evans. Dr. Ellis-Evans is a historian of ancient Greece who works on the regional history of Western Asia Minor, the monetary economy of the Greek world, and the literature of the post-classical polis. Since 2022, he has been the George Cockwell Fellow in Ancient History at University College, Oxford, and an Associate Professor in the Faculty of Classics at the University of Oxford. His first book, Kingdom of Priam, Lesbos and the Troad Between Anatolia and the Aegean, is how I got to him, for my own completely selfish reasons, dealing with Lesbos, and examined the various factors which promoted or thwarted regional integration between the island and the mainland from the 5th century BC to the 1st century CE. His second book, Alexandria Troas in the Hellenistic Period, War, Finance, and Civic Identity, uses the evidence of coinage to reconstruct how the city of a city in the Troad navigated the regional and supra-regional politics of the Hellenistic period from its foundation by one of Alexander's successors to its disestablishment, I like this term, as a polis, and refoundation as a Roman colony by Emperor Augustus. His talk today draws us back to Lesbos for a presentation on the cult of Dionysos Phallen on Lesbos, religion, identity, and insularity. Without further ado, I'll welcome you to SFU.
Okay, well, I'd like to start first by thanking Dimitri for the invitation to speak and for the support that I've had from SFU to come here with my wife Lydia, and it's been a great and really welcoming trip so far. So my subject today is the pagan cult of Dionysus Phallen. I think I'll just read it off the iPad and then yeah, I don't think it's working. Never trust the technology. Yeah, it only works when that's on. Yeah. Right, so this cult object here, Dionysus Phallen. So this cult centered on the worship of a mysterious cult object that was dredged from the sea by fishermen and worshipped at Methymna as a representation of the god Dionysus. So the evidence relating to this cult can be split into two broad groups. In the first group, we have 3 literary accounts composed between the 2nd and 5th century CE by authors who were not from Lesbos. And so these are Oinomaus of Gadara, who's a philosopher from the city of Gadara in northern Palestine, Pausanias, a travel writer from Magnesia ad Sipylum, sort of modern Manisa in Western Asia Minor, and then Theodoret, a theologian from Cyrrhus in northern Syria. And in the second group, we have the evidence of coins and inscriptions produced by the cities of Lesbos themselves between the 3rd century BCE and the 3rd century CE. So the evidence of the 3 literary accounts suggests that Dionysus Phallen was a cult of Methymna alone. By contrast, the evidence from Lesbos itself suggests, first, that multiple cities on the island worshipped cults of Dionysus which correspond to the description of the cult in the literary sources. And second, that Methymna's own interest in the cult was a relatively late development. So while we might expect the evidence from Lesbos itself to take precedence over literary accounts by non-lesbians, and for earlier evidence to be considered more important than later evidence, in fact, the opposite has been true. Scholars of Greek religion studying this cult have interpreted the epigraphic and numismatic evidence from Lesbos through the lens of the literary accounts, rather than trying to understand that evidence on its own terms. And in addition, they've tended to approach the evidence synchronically, selectively combining pieces of evidence from completely different eras on the assumption that the underlying reality of the cult never really changed in antiquity. So, in addition to what, the fairly obvious methodological problems with that approach to the evidence, more fundamentally, I think there are kind of two broader methodological problems here. One to do with how we study ancient Greek religion, and the other to do with how we study insularity. So in the case of ancient Greek religion, there's traditionally been a tendency to emphasize what different cults of a Greek god have in common rather than how they differ, and to assume that cults were relatively stable over time rather than having eventful histories that need to be understood in their chronological sequence. And in the case of cults of Dionysus on Lesbos, this has led scholars to treat the evidence for multiple different cults as all relating to the same cult, and to overlook the very clear evidence for changes in the importance of each cult over time. A major consequence of taking that approach to the cult is that it smooths out the differences between the cults of each city, replacing a complex picture in which multiple similar-looking cults interact with one another with a homogenized and unchanging vision of how Dionysus was worshipped on Lesbos. And this is where I think there's a connection with how we think about insularity. The fact that islands are easy to conceptually delineate, they end where the sea begins, can encourage us to think of them as natural unities with homogeneous identities. In reality, though, islands, and especially large islands like Lesbos, are no more natural unities than any territory on the mainland is. Insular identity is therefore not something all the inhabitants of an island are naturally going to agree on, but rather something which is contested and competed over within the island. So when we homogenize the cults of Dionysus on Lesbos into a single cultic complex, what we're also doing is obscuring the internal dynamics of competition on the island between these different cults. Conversely, if we remain sensitive to the differences between each city's cult, and we try to understand how they change over time, the workings of that internal insular dynamic are going to become much clearer. So let's start with a sort of very brief intro to what you need to know about Lesbos in antiquity. So the complex internal dynamic of Lesbos in antiquity, which I've just been talking about, was the result of Lesbos being an island with multiple independent cities in antiquity. But this is a picture which changes quite radically over the course of multiple centuries. So in the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, this is an island of 6 cities. But by the time we get to the second half of the 2nd century BCE, there are only 3 cities. And that's happened due to the expansionism of the 2 most powerful cities on the island, Mytilene down in the southeast and Methymna in the north. And there are really kind of 3 moments here. So the first is at some moment in the 7th or 6th century BCE, Arisba, right in the center of the island, is enslaved by Methymna. And so that's how Methymna gets access to that central Gulf of Pyrrha. And then at some point in the later 3rd century BC, Mytilene grabs the town of Pyrrha. And then finally in 167 BC, Antissa, up on the northwestern coast of the island, gives support to Rome's enemies during one of the wars with Macedon, and is punished for that by having its population and territory transferred to Methymna. So in addition to these successful episodes of expansion, there's also a very important failed attempt at expansion, which is that in 428 BC, Mytilene attempted to revolt from the Athenian Empire and forcibly unite the entire island under its rule. And And in a turn of events absolutely typical of their long-term hostility, when Methymna hears that this is going to happen, they immediately dob them into the Athenians. The Athenians then come and do fairly horrible things to the Mycenaeans, and that's the end of that attempt. But it's definitely indicative of what people want to achieve on this island, and what the kind of countervailing forces are that prevent unification of Lesbos. So what I hope is clear from that brief narrative is there's a highly competitive intra-island dynamic on Lesbos between these cities, and there's very little love lost between them. So we certainly shouldn't take it for granted that they felt any solidarity with one another just because they happen to inhabit the same island. That being said, it's also worth emphasizing that the geography of Lesbos makes it difficult for a single state to monopolize the island. And a number of different factors contribute to this. So the first is size. Lesbos is the 8th largest island in the Mediterranean. And it's sort of on this threshold between islands which are, significantly larger than it, like, Crete and Cyprus in the Aegean, which are too large to ever really be run by a single community, and that's not something that's ever really happened. Versus places which are just slightly smaller, like Rhodes and Chios, which can be and were taken over by a single state and run by a single state. The second factor is travel. So the island's size means that it can't be quickly circumnavigated by ship. And equally, its rugged interior means it's always been slow to cross the island by land. And particularly so, there was no work wasn't begun on an integrated road network on Lesbos until 1883. And even now, with the road network, it's not that. I've taken the 3-hour bus from Mytilene to Scala Erythou, and I wouldn't recommend it. So as a result, cities in different parts of the island tend to live in their own worlds. It's quicker to get from Methymna and Mytilene to the mainland opposite these cities than it is to travel from one to the other. And Erissos down in the southwest might as well be its own Aegean island. And then together, these two factors of size and travel mean that a single city like Mytilene can't easily monopolize the export of goods from the island because it usually makes more sense to export goods from where the goods are produced than to bear the cost of transporting them back to Mytilene. This is something which, if you scroll forward to the evidence from the 19th century, is incredibly clear, where as the island's olive oil production really takes off, you see alternative economic centers growing up on the two internal gulfs, because it made more sense to harvest, process, and export olive oil from a spot on the Gulf of Colonia or the Gulf of Hierra than to funnel this through Mytilene. And so I suspect it's always been the case that economic activity has been inherently decentralized on the island. So as much as Mytilene and Methymna may have wanted to dominate Lesbos, the reality is that it's always been very difficult to achieve this in every period of the island's history. And as a result, there's always been a need for cities on the island to find ways to cooperate with one another, as well as competing with one another. So in antiquity, this took the form of the sanctuary of Meson, so literally the middle place, which is located on the Gulf of Pyrrha in the center of the island. Throughout antiquity, an annual festival was held here, which was attended by all the cities of Lesbos. And for many periods of the island's history, it doesn't seem to do much more than that. But there are periods where its potential to represent the island as a whole is realized. And a particular example of that is in the first half of the 2nd century BCE, the cities of Lesbos formed a league known as a koinon, so literally a kind of a common thing, centered on the sanctuary at Messon during a time of particular geopolitical danger and uncertainty in the Aegean. And again, sort of very typical of this balance between kind of competition and collaboration, the terms of the agreement between the cities show a focus both on mutual defense, but also on finding better ways to resolve conflicts between the cities. So this push and pull of competition and collaboration is the key thing to understand about the internal dynamics of Lesbos in antiquity. Lesbos was crucial to the identity of all the cities on the island, but not so much as a shared identity in itself, but rather as a way of geographically delimiting the set of peers which these cities most wanted to best, but would also most readily turn to for support. So Dionysos Phallen in the literary sources. So this is where we're going to talk about passages 1, 2, and 3 on the handout. As I mentioned in the introduction, we've got 3 literary accounts which talk about this cult of Dionysus Phallen. And they've had an outsized impact on how scholarship understands the cult. So the earliest of the 3 accounts is from Oinomaus of Gadara. Oinomaus was a Cynic philosopher from Gadara in northern Palestine, active during the reign of Hadrian. So this is the 120s, the 130s CE. And although he was himself a pagan, he was highly skeptical of certain aspects of pagan religion, above all oracles. And so to this end, he writes this work, Detection of Charlatans, which is a polemic against oracles. The work itself is lost, but it's quoted at length by the church historian Eusebius of Caesarea in his preparation for the Gospel, which dates to 310, 320 CE. And Eusebius is obviously interested in this because Oinomaus's attack on oracles suits his purpose of showing that pagan religion is fraudulent. And Oinomaus brings up the story of Dionysus Phallen because he views it as a particularly ridiculous example of an oracle behaving in a dishonest way. To his mind, this so-called cult object is very clearly just a random bit of flotsam that some gullible Methymnian fishermen have taken out of the sea and decided to start worshipping. And then Delphi, who can't be trusted with anything, have said, oh yeah, that's definitely a cult object. And he's like, well, look at, how silly is this? So then next, we've got the account of Pausanias. From Magnesia ad Sipylum in Western Asia Minor, probably, and was traveling and doing research for his work, the description of Greece, from about kind of 150s through to about 180. And the passage in Pausanias concerning Dionysus Phallen is from Book 10. And in that book, he's describing the region of focus in central Greece, and in particular, the Pan-Hellenic sanctuary of Delphi there. And broadly speaking, the structure of this work is that Pausanias describes the monuments he sees, and then any interesting stories attached to those monuments. And sometimes the stories that he goes into seem to take a lot longer than actually saying anything about the monument. And it's really just a way to kind of hang a lot of these his own reading onto that. And so in this case, he encounters the bronze replica of the Dionysus Phallen cult object, which Methymna sent to Delphi. And this prompts him to tell the story of the original object's origin. And then finally, there's a brief notice in the early Christian author Theodoret. So Theodoret was a theologian and bishop from Cyrrhus in northern Syria, active in the first half of the 5th century CE. And book 10 of his work, A Cure for Greek Maladies, focuses on true and false oracles. And as an example of an obviously false oracle, He cites the one which Apollo Pythias gives to the Methymnians about Dionysos Phallen, where he interprets the epithet Phallen to do with phallus, and he says, well, you know, this is ridiculous. Why is Delphi saying that these people should basically worship penisy Dionysus? And he doesn't mention, unlike the other two accounts, which I'm going to kind of refer to as the main accounts, he doesn't mention any of the object's backstory, and he appears to be entirely dependent on Eusebius's quotation of Oinomaus. So there's no suggestion that he has the same access to whatever lost source Oinomaus and Pausanias were working with. So the two main accounts, those of Oinomaus and Pausanias, tell broadly the same story, but they mention some different details. So both authors say that fishermen from Methymna caught a piece of olive wood in their nets. And Pausanias describes the object as a prosopon, so a kind of a face or a mask. But then he also says it's a xoanon, so which is, you know, a full figure cult object made of wood. Well, how can it be both a face and a body? The answer is in Oinomaus, who says the top of the olive wood log had humanoid features. So, I mean, this is literally, you know, the Virgin Mary turning up in your toast. So this explains how Pausanias can simultaneously describe the object both as a prosopon and as a xoanon. Okay, fine. Pausanias then describes its appearance as divine, but then also as strange or foreign and unlike images of Greek gods. And it's the fact that they can't recognize the cult object that means that they need to consult the Delphic oracle to identify which god this is and how they should be worshipping it. And then Oinomaus adds the detail that the fishermen threw the object back into the sea several times, and at one point they even sailed to Libya, i.e. opposite end of the Mediterranean to Methymna being the point there, to get rid of it, but then it turned up in their nets again. And Oinomaus, who is really getting into his stride at that point in the passage, says, well, do you know a great way of not getting it back in your nets? Just leave it on the land. Anyway, so the implication here is that what makes them realize that this might be a divine object is that it keeps miraculously turning up in their nets. And the response of the oracle is that the Methymnians should worship the object as Dionysus Phallen. So as you'll see, Oinomaus quotes part of the oracle itself, and that shows that the epithet Phallen comes from Delphi. And then finally, there is a curious disagreement between Oinomaus and Theodora on what the epithet means. So Oinomaus says, oh, well, he clearly thinks that it means that the object is made of olive wood, whereas Theodora, when discussing it, says this clearly comes from, well, the way he talks about it indicates it clearly, he thinks it clearly comes from phallus. And that's a bit strange. We'll come back to that in a moment. So there are a few loose ends here, which I just want you to kind of bear in mind for the discussion going forward. So the first is this interpretation of the epithet Phallen to mean made of olive wood in Oinomaus. I mean, that makes no etymological sense whatsoever. And it much more obviously should come from the word phallus. And that, you know, presumably, well, as you will see in a moment, there are reasons for thinking that this refers to the shape of the object and it being phallic. But it remains odd that Oinomaus has this completely false etymology, which he's certain of. The second thing is it's totally unclear from these accounts when all of this happened or was imagined to have happened. The whole story takes place in this kind of timeless past, which, you know, could have been yesterday, could have been 500 years ago. And then finally, while we can be sure that this tradition existed by the beginning of the 2nd century CE, when Oinomaus encounters it, it's far from clear how much further back it goes. Is this an authentically ancient tradition which is being passed down through hundreds of years, or is this something that is fairly recently invented in the imperial period. So, what does the evidence from Lesbos itself actually say? So all the cities of Lesbos worshipped Dionysus, and they all worshipped a good number of other gods as well. However, within each civic pantheon, cults rose and fell in importance over time, and cities chose to emphasize particular aspects of these cults as and when it became important to them to do so. And in tracing these shifts, some of the best evidence we have is coinage. And there are several reasons for this. So first, these coins are products of the cities of Lesbos themselves. The minting is overseen by civic officials. And we have examples from elsewhere of coin design even being discussed in the political assembly. So we can be fairly certain that within the constraints of coin design, these types faithfully represent how these cities wanted to be seen at the time that they were produced. And of course, crucially, there is no opportunity for this evidence to then be manipulated in a kind of a literary tradition or anything like that. It's like, this is what they thought at that time, and it's a snapshot of that. The second thing is that coins are mass produced. So even a small series would be in the tens of thousands, and many were in the hundreds or thousands or millions. So even though the overwhelming majority of ancient coinage is now lost, as is the case with every category of evidence from antiquity, it's always the case that a handful of examples survive from each series. And we can therefore be confident that we have a fairly complete record of the coin types which were produced. And as a result, in this particular case, absence of evidence tends to actually be evidence of absence. If it's not there, it's not like, oh, well, maybe, with inscriptions, you can always say, well, maybe an inscription will turn up tomorrow, which will screw everything I've just argued up. It's probably not the case with coins. And then finally, coins tend to be more precisely datable than a lot of the other types of evidence that could be relevant here. And there are a variety of reasons for that, which I'm happy to get into, but equally, if you would rather not have me explain that at great length, I won't. But consequently, coins are much very well suited to tracing the rise and fall in significance of different cults, and for identifying who is influencing whom when we see fashions emerge, because you can actually date quite a lot of this stuff to, not the century or half century, but the decade or the year. Okay, so we'll start with Methymna. So the literary accounts of Oenomaus, Pausanias, and Theodora, which we've just been looking at, would lead us to expect that Dionysos Phallen was a prominent cult at Methymna throughout the city's history. But when we actually look at the evidence from Methymna, that's not really what we see. So starting with this was mostly for Dimitri because it's got the Greek school at Molovos, is where the inscription was found. We know from inscriptions that the Dionysia was an important festival at Methymna in the Hellenistic period, so 3rd to 1st centuries BCE. And in particular, it featured a periphora, so a carrying around ceremony for the agalma, the cult statue of Dionysus. And we actually have some idea what this would have involved, thanks to the parallel example of Hermes Perforeus at Ainos, which is modern Enes in European Turkey. And interestingly, this is a story which actually has a number of striking similarities with the Dionysus Phallen story, even though it involves a totally different god. Fishermen from Ainos catch a wooden object in their nets. They initially don't recognize it as a cult object, but various miracles, it keeps turning up in their nets, and when they try and hack it and burn it, it's indestructible, make them realize what it is. The oracle at Delphi confirms that it's a cult object, and worship of the object involves a periphora ceremony in which it's carried around, and brilliantly, they actually put it on their coins. And so this is the cult object being, and then you kind of lift it around and have a great time. Based on this parallel, scholars have inferred that the cult statue, which was being carried around at Methymna's Dionysia festival, must have been the Dionysos Phallen cult object. However, it's worth noting that Erissos on Lesbos also had ceremony at its Dionysia. So clearly, therefore, Methymna wasn't the only city on the island archaic cult statue of Dionysus it's celebrated in this way. And so we can't actually jump to the conclusion that the agalma, which is not further described in the Methymna inscriptions, is specifically this Dionysus Phallen cult object. So what I've done in this table is try to give you a kind of an overview of the different sort of types that were used on Methymna's coinage from the 4th to the 2nd century BCE. So you've got dates down the left-hand side, obverse and reverse silver types, obverse and reverse bronze types, and then I sort of use different colors to highlight gods which are turning up again and again. So Athena is green, anything to do with Dionysus is blue, Apollo is purple, and then the yellow is Arion of Methymna, who we'll come back to in a minute. So I think the most striking thing about this, when you sort of get that overview of what the Methymnians are putting on their coins, is Dionysus isn't that prominent. Until the 2nd century, we're getting images associated with Dionysus, but not Dionysus himself. So grapes, because he's the god of wine. Cantharus is a sort of two-handled wine cup, so that's the association there. But actually, you have to wait until the 2nd century BCE for the first actual depictions of Dionysus on Methymna's coinage. And if you look at this, much more important is, for example, Athena, and actually, the thing which comes through much more strongly is Arion. So Arion of Methymna was, arguably the city's most famous son, and he turns up all over the literary sources from antiquity, but in particular, very famous passage of Herodotus, Book 1. So Herodotus, writing in the 5th century, tells the story. So this is Arion here. Tells the story that he was a famous singer in the late 7th or early 6th century BC, who was responsible for inventing the dithyramb, which is a hymn sung in honor of Dionysus. And he's on a voyage from Corinth to Tarentum in southern Italy when the sailors on his ship decide that they're going to double cross him, steal his money, and throw him overboard. And he catches wind of this and says, okay, let me just sing one more song and then I'll throw myself overboard. So it's too tempting to hear the greatest singer in the world sing. So they're like, okay, do your thing. And then he sings, jumps overboard, and is rescued by a dolphin. And he then, and here he is doing this, rides the dolphin all the way back to Corinth, where he exposes the sailors for what they've done and is victorious. So, given Arion's role in inventing the dithyramb, it's possible that that's how Methymna was celebrating Dionysus via Arion. But even if that's the case, it's still notable that the Methymnians are choosing to focus on Arion rather than on depicting their archaic cult statue of Dionysus. They've made a clear choice there. In fact, there are only 2 periods when Dionysus Phallen is depicted on coins of Methymna. So the first, shortly after 167 BCE, there's a unique coin with the types of the neighboring city of Antissa, but an M for Methymna on the reverse. We'll return to that one in a moment. But that's a complete, it's a single coin in the British Museum. It's a complete one-off. The more kind of sustained attempt at showing interest in this is instead from the early 160s and early 180s CE, so kind of 4 centuries later, where we get three types which show Dionysus Phallen on the obverse and then on the reverse of this one. So despite the fact that our literary sources uniformly claim that Dionysus Phallen was a cult of Methymna, the Methymnians themselves fail to consistently depict Dionysus Phallen on their coinage until a generation after Oenomaus wrote about the cult in the 120s and 130s, and around the same time as Pausanias was writing about the bronze copy of the cult statue at Delphi in the third quarter of the 2nd century. So to make sense of this strange disjuncture between what the literary evidence is telling us and what the evidence from Methymna itself indicates, we need to turn to its small neighbor to the west, Antissa. So evidence from Antissa is very limited. There is now, since 2018, the effort has an active dig there, but they've published nothing so far, and I wouldn't hold your breath. But we know from an economic treatise of the late 4th century BC that it had an important festival of Dionysus. More importantly, though, in the second half of the 3rd century BC, the city minted 2 series of bronze coins which feature the head of Dionysus Phallen on the reverse. And as you can see, this is very clearly the same cult object depicted on the imperial era coinage of Methymna 4 centuries later. So how has that happened? As I briefly mentioned earlier, in 167 BC, the Romans punished Antissa for supporting their enemies by stripping the city of its independence and transferring the population and territory of Antissa to Methymna. And from this point onwards, Methymna will have been responsible for all the cults on the former territory of Antissa, and as a result will have been able to claim the cult of Dionysus Phallen for themselves. And actually we have, as it happens, some contemporary evidence for Methymna doing just this. So there are 2 rare hybrid coin types which combine the types of the 2 cities. So the first, so this is the unique coin from the British Museum I just mentioned. So it's taking the Apollo and Dionysus Phallen types of Antissa's bronze coinage, not changing the types at all, but just adding an M where previously it said Antis for Antissa. And the second one, which is sort of more properly, I think, a hybrid coin, they've combined the bull and club type from Antissa's coins and the Arion on the dolphin type from Methymna's coins into a single coin type. And this turns up a little bit more frequently. I think I've collected 11 or 12 examples, but I mean, it's not huge. So presumably what these types must have been minted in the immediate aftermath of Methymna absorbing Antissa, and what they're reflecting is Methymna's newfound ownership of the cults and traditions of Antissa. So it's fairly clear that the cult of Dionysus Phallen was in origin not a cult of Methymna at all, but actually a cult of Antissa. And the simple reason Methymna doesn't feature this unique cult object on its coinage any earlier than the hybrid coin of circa 167 is that before this point, the cult did not belong to Methymna, but to Antissa. So this in turn suggests that the decision to feature the head of Dionysus Phallen on Methymna's coins in the 160s and 180s CE is a piece of deliberate antiquarianism. And actually, I think this is kind of confirmed by how closely these 2 of the 3 types imitate the Hellenistic era portraits. This is very clearly die engravers looking at old coins and copying those types. And it happens at roughly the same time as they also put out some Arion of Methymna coins, which appear to also be copying Hellenistic coins with that type from there. So this is really an example. I mean, this is the second sophistic in action, basically, but with a bit of lying injected into it. Yeah, just so we can kind of keep the chronology straight here. This in turn raises the question of how Oenomaus and Pausanias ended up with the impression that Dionysus Phallen had always been a cult of Methymna. These two authors were clearly drawing on the same tradition from an unknown source, which dates to some point between the end of Antissa in 167 BCE and the 120 CE when Oenomaus was writing. I think it might be significant that Pausanias was prompted to tell the story because he encountered a bronze copy of the cult object, which had been dedicated at Delphi. So we typically expect such a dedication to be accompanied by a dedicatory inscription indicating who made the dedication and why. If the dedication had been made at the time the cult object had actually been found, whenever that may have been, or when it was at whatever point that first became a focus of worship, that was when it belonged to Antissa, not to Methymna. And so we would expect the inscription to quite clearly say this is a dedication made by the Antissans. Since Pausanias is instead under the impression that this is a cult of Methymna, I think it's reasonable to infer that the dedicatory inscription said this is an object of Methymna and gave him no indication that anything else might be going on there. And so I think this implies that the object Pausanias saw had been sent to Delphi by the Methymnians at some point after the destruction of Antissa, when they could claim the cult of Dionysus Phallen for themselves. And probably the purpose of sending the dedication was to solidify their claim to this cult and to firmly cut Antissa out of the story. And of course, what they're doing is they're putting an object with their version of events in a Pan-Hellenic sanctuary where Greeks who don't know anything about Lesbos can come, read it, and think, straightforward, this is what's going on here. And so that I think is clearly the kind of the political purpose, if you like, of that dedication. So the evidence from Antissa and Methymna seems to tell a fairly clear story of the history of the cult of Dionysus Phallen, which puts the literary accounts in their proper context. Dionysus Phallen was originally a cult of Antissa, which Methymna took over when it absorbed Antissa in 167. While Methymna was initially willing to acknowledge the Antissan origins of the cult, as I think the hybrid coins suggest, over time they decided to simply claim it for themselves. And this is the version of events which reached Oenomaus and Pausanias, who, not being from Lesbos, were in no position to critically assess the story that they'd been told. Okay, so the final piece of the puzzle is the evidence from Mytilene. So Mytilene's coinage has a rich set of depictions of the city's cult statue of Dionysus, the clearest being on the city's high-value silver coinage from the 160s BCE. So these coins show a head of Zeus Ammon with the distinctive Ammon's horn behind the ear on the obverse. And then on the reverse, we have this really great depiction of the cult statue. So what we see here is a bearded mask of Dionysus attached to a crude triangular block of wood representing the god's body. The mask is bearded and it wears a tall hat known as a polos, which is wreathed in ivy, which is a symbol of Dionysus, and his hair falls in long braids over the kind of the shoulders of the body. The body itself is dressed in a nebris, so a fawn skin, typically worn by Dionysus and his adherents. And then finally, the entire design is framed within an ivy wreath for its Dionysiac associations. And in Greek religion, this type of cult statue where a head or mask depicting the god is attached to a wooden body is typically associated either with rural cults, and so this is what you're sort of seeing on these two 5th century vases here, or with cult objects of great antiquity, and particularly things that might be described by a Greek as a xoanon, as Pausanias does. So elsewhere on Mytilene's coinage, we get a few more details about this cult object. So one of Mytilene's silver coins uniquely depicts the cult statue in what looks like a niche below a slanting roof. So this could represent how the cult object was presented in the temple, or perhaps in a ceremonial context, such as a periphora ceremony. Much more common, however, is depictions of the cult object on the prow of a ship, which you see here. These begin in the mid-2nd century BC, and they continue right through to the 3rd century CE. So they clearly represent a very important part of the cult. At a minimum, this suggests that the Mytilene's Dionysus cult statue was likewise fished out of the sea. Beyond this, though, it may be that the ship was actually part of the cult statue's periphora ceremony. I came across this example, which is brilliant. At Smyrna, there was a ceremony for their cult of Dionysus Briseus, in which the priest of Dionysus steered the ship into the Agora. And so anyway, so I like to imagine that that's what they're doing at Mytilene. What's perhaps most striking about Mytilene's Dionysus cult statue, which I've sort of put in the middle here, is that it corresponds closely to what we would expect the Dionysos Phallen cult object to look like based on the literary sources. It's got a strange face, it's made of a block of wood, has a block of wood for a body, and the association with ship's prow suggests that it came from the sea. So, and some people have even thought that Mytilene was stealing Methymna's cult object. But actually, if we focus in on the details of these different visual representations, it's clear that we're looking at two separate cult objects. The first important detail is that the Antissa Methymna object is a full head. And we can see this because it has a neck connection, often shown at the bottom. And also there is this sort of sense that it has a back of a head. By contrast, the one time that we get the Mytilene object shown side on, which is here on this coin, it looks much more like it's a mask, so there's nothing at the back of the head. And there's also never any suggestion of a neck connection as well. Secondly, the Antissa Methymna object wears a headdress, which you can see here. So there's a kind of a tiara or hat, or I've not quite decided what to call that. But then clearly there's this headdress coming down the back of the neck there. Whereas, of course, the Mytilene object has a polos, which is decorated with, so there's the top of the polos there, and here's the ivy around it. So completely different headgear. And the Antissa Methymna object has a kind of this, so this is the Phallen beard. So, you know, let's, for the sake of argument, call it unnatural looking. Whereas the Mytilene object has a much more normal looking beard, and likewise there. And then finally, with the Antissa Methymna object, we never see its body, whereas we always see, or almost always see, the body with Mytilene's object. Okay, so another one of these tables. It turns out in PowerPoint, there's different color palettes for if you want to fill in a square versus if you want to highlight, so I wasn't able to make them match. But purple Apollo, blue Dionysus is the message here. So while worship of Dionysus had always been important at Mytilene, the coin evidence shows that there was a sudden and decisive shift towards making this cult, and specifically this cult statue, central to Mytilene's civic identity after 170 BCE. So in this table, I'm summarizing the coinage up to that point. And what you can see is it's almost all Apollo. And then there are only two real occasions where we see a bit of Dionysiac imagery and actually the Dionysus herm, but these only appear as subsidiary images. So they're not the main coin type, they're an extra image on the coin type which has an administrative function within the mint. I'm happy to explain what a control mark is if people care. So this is very clearly not the most important thing. By contrast, you go to the period after 170, a complete shift. So in the 160s, Mytilene mints the high-value silver coins with civic types depicting the Dionysus cult statue that I've just been describing in detail. They also produce kind of what's known as Alexander-type coinage. Again, happy to explain what that actually is. And all of a sudden, it goes from Dionysus being an occasional subsidiary image to the most common thing by some distance. And so we've got the Dionysus cult statue, the cult statue in a niche, the Dionysus mask, a thyrsus, which is a stick of fennel with a pine cone at the top, which you tie fillets to, and when you're a bacchant, and then you wander around shaking it at people. I believe, and a phlaston is the decorative piece on the prow of a ship, and I take that to be a reference to the ship's prow that the Dionysus cult statue is seen on. The other really big shift is all the types of the bronze coinage switch over to Zeus Ammon and Dionysus or Dionysus related stuff. And everything that they had done before this point disappears from the repertoire. So if you come back here, you see, typically it's lots of stuff to do with Apollo and a bit of Artemis and whatever. That then goes. And we have a complete shift there. So in short, from about 170 BCE onwards, Mytilene depicted their cult statue of Dionysus on their coins at every opportunity that they got. I do not think there is a coin of Mytilene produced in the 2nd or 1st century BC after 170 where they don't manage to get Dionysus on there somehow. Usually when we see such a dramatic shift in which god a city's coins celebrate, it's because something important has happened relating to that god. And as it happens, there are two very nice examples of this from Alexandria Troas and Lampsacus in the Trad from the 2nd century BCE, so directly contemporary with what we're talking about. So first is, my new book, available in all good bookstores. So in 188 BCE, Alexandria Troas incorporated the neighboring city of Hamaxitos, and with it, the sanctuary of Apollo Smintheus, which was on its territory. And this cult is invoked by the Trojan priest Chryses in the first 40 lines of the Iliad, and thus had tremendous cultural capital attached to it. It's the one bit of the Iliad people have probably read. And so, as a result, as soon as Alexandria got control of this sanctuary, it immediately switched to depicting the cult statue of Apollo Smintheus on all its coins, alongside investing heavily in rebuilding the sanctuary and expanding the Smintheia festival. So here, these are the coins of Hamaxitos that they were minting just before they were swallowed up by Alexandria. And there is the cult statue of Apollo Smintheus with quiver, bow, and patera for sacrificing. These are the very first bronzes that Alexandria Troas produces straight after they get the sanctuary saying cult statue. And at the very first opportunity they have to produce really beautiful silver coinage, there he is again, and that then sort of stays there on. The second case is from Lampsacus on the Hellespont. So in the late 130s BCE, during heavy fighting in the region, the Lampsacines believed themselves to have received an epiphany from the god Priapus and his mother Aphrodite. Priapus had always been a god of Lampsacus. He was kind of widely accepted to have been born at Lampsacus, but he'd never once appeared on the city's coins before, mostly because he's very obviously viewed as being kind of quite inappropriate. By contrast, after he was believed to have appeared and saved the city, images of Priapus suddenly become ubiquitous on the coinage of Lampsacus from antiquity. So these are quite handsome silver tetradrachms that they produce in the kind of 90 to 70 BCE. And then if you move forward to the coinage they produce in the imperial period, half of all coin types that they produce have Priapus on them. So these parallel cases in turn raise two questions. The first is, what changed in the 160 to make Mytilene suddenly focus on its cult of Dionysus? I should say, I'm not sure I totally know the answer for this, but this is my best guess at the moment. The most significant thing which happened on Lesbos at this time was, of course, Methymna absorbing Antissa. A possibility, therefore, is that it was Mytilene seeing its long-term rival Methymna come into possession of the venerable cult statue of Dionysus Phallen that prompted Mytilene to in turn emphasize the bona fides of its own archaic cult statue of Dionysus. So when it is tiny, unimportant Antissa, they don't really care. But the moment it's Methymna, oh, now suddenly this is interesting to them and it's something that they want to compete over. This, though, raises a second question. Why didn't Methymna make more of the cult of Dionysus Phallen once it had acquired it? The comparison with Alexandria Troas and the cult of Apollo Smintheus may be instructive here. Alexandria already had its own cult of Apollo when it acquired Apollo Smintheus, just as Methymna already had a cult of Dionysus when it acquired Dionysus Phallen. Yet Alexandria immediately switched its focus to Apollo Smintheus, whereas Methymna didn't likewise immediately switch its focus to Dionysus Phallen. I think the difference between the two cases may be the relative prestige of the cults. Alexandria's previous cult of Apollo had no particular connection to Homer, whereas Apollo Smintheus did. Access to this all-important cultural capital therefore explains their willingness to switch their focus to the newly acquired cult. By contrast, Dionysus Phallen was not an obvious upgrade over Methymna's pre-existing cult of Dionysus in terms of cultural capital. When the Methymnians thought about what part of their civic traditions they wanted to promote to the wider Greek world, their connection to the famous Arian of Methymna clearly still seemed much more important. So, some conclusions. Our literary accounts give the impression that the cult of Dionysus Phallen had existed at Methymna since time immemorial, and that its most distinctive feature, its cult object, was unique to Methymna. And as we've seen, in reality, every city on Lesbos had a cult object like that of Dionysus Phallen. And in fact, it was Antissa, not Methymna, to whom the Dionysus Phallen cult object had originally belonged. So if we step back from the evidence, I think two contradictory themes emerge. First, the importance of the differences between these cults, and second, the importance of the similarities between these cults. So if I start with the differences, the evidence from Lesbos makes it clear that all the cities of Lesbos had their own cults of Dionysus, each of which was centered on an archaic cult statue similar to that of Dionysus Phallen. And as we see with Mytilene and Antissa / Methymna, the case where we've got really good visual evidence for the objects in question, the differences between these cult objects are there, but you wouldn't exactly say they were enormous. These are broadly similar objects from our perspective. However, I do wonder whether we would be wrong to dismiss these differences just because they seem small to us. Within an island context in which each of these cities was highly aware of how each of the other cities worshipped their own cult of Dionysus, the narcissism of small differences will have ensured that these minor differences will have been perceived to have had outsized importance. In addition to each city having its own distinctive cult statue, we also see each city taking a different attitude to the cult's importance for their civic identity, celebrating them in different ways at different points in time. So, for example, Antissa celebrated its cult object of Dionysus Phallen on its coins at a time in the second half of the 3rd century BCE, when almost no other cities of Lesbos were doing likewise. By contrast, Methymna, even after taking possession of Antissa's cult, didn't celebrate the cult object in a sustained way on its coinage until over 4 centuries later. In the case of Mytilene, while there are some signs it was taking an interest in its cult statue of Dionysus at the same time as Antissa, the main shift instead comes in the 160s, apparently in response to the fall of Antissa. And then finally, Eresos, a city I barely mentioned in this paper, never featured Dionysus at all on its coins, yet we know from the inscriptions that it had a Dionysus festival with a Periphora ceremony, just like Methymna. So as that kind of brief summary hopefully makes clear, there isn't one story about the worship of Dionysus on Lesbos, but rather multiple different stories specific to each city on the island. However, the very fact that each city had its own cult of Dionysus, which it treated in its own way, makes the existence of the many similarities between these cults all the more notable in some respects. So all the cities had an archaic cult statue of Dionysus, and those from Antissa, Methymna, and from Mytilene were constructed from wood in fairly similar ways. In the case of Methymna and Eresos, and perhaps also Mytilene, this cult object was celebrated at a Dionysia festival with a Periphora ceremony. And Antissa, Methymna, and Mytilene had origin stories for their cult, which involved the object coming from the sea and having a strange appearance. And, frankly, I do wonder if we had more evidence, would we simply find that all of those elements were true of all of the objects from all of the cities? So what we seem to have here is a distinctively lesbian approach to cults of Dionysus, where each city's cult has a great deal in common with the other cults of Dionysus on Lesbos, but relatively little in common with cults of Dionysus in neighboring regions. So, for example, there are plenty of cults of Dionysus on the coast of Asia Minor opposite Lesbos, but none of them has the same focus on an archaic cult statue which came from the sea. So the simultaneous importance of both the similarities and the differences between these cults perfectly illustrates the intra-island converged on a similar set of characteristics for their cults of Dionysus through awareness of one another. But in doing so, they turned these cults not into a shared insular identity, but rather a point of rivalry with one another. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. It's very, very rich. Not a question, but I want to open it up to others, not to exercise my privileges.
Yeah, thanks for this, and echo what Dimitri just said, super rich. So I may not get the dates right again, but bear with me. So yeah, I love the conclusion about the Apollos Pithems versus the coolness of it mentioned in the Iliad versus the Phallen kind of lacks it. So do you have a guess why did he become more prominent in the 2nd century CE? Like it was going on in the empire, broadly thinking. I mean, we have whatever like Pliny's texts on Christians, right? Should we kill them? Should we not? In around kind of Asia Minor, we see cults from other kind of parts of the Roman Empire now spreading around. So does this cult kind of look? Because it visually looks, when I first started, I was like, oh, this looks more kind of late antique-ish in a way. So does it just visually correspond more to the new aesthetic or not? Or like, what would be the reason why this cult all of a sudden and not just some other Dionysus, right?
Yeah. So so I'm trying to recall what the rest of the provincial coinage looked at. Okay. It is generally true that from the 2nd century onwards, the types of coins minted by Greek cities under the empire become much more focused on local myths and traditions. And this fits into the broader intellectual movement of the 2nd sophistic, of people going back to their traditions and doing a certain amount of antiquarian research to find out about things. And actually, Apollos Minthus is a good example of this, where this Roman colony is sort of plonked down there. The Greek city evaporates. The Roman colonists who've all come from Italy don't care about the Hellenistic city whatsoever. But then come the 2nd century, they're like, oh, we could really do with some myths and traditions, and then turn around and sort of, sure enough, they have this marvelous sanctuary of Apollos Minthus, and they're like, great, let's find out a bit more about this. And that's the point at which they start featuring their cult object and stories about their cult object much more. So I think what you're seeing at Methymna is a kind of smaller, more experimental version of that, where, with Alexandria Troas, they changed their entire coinage in the 2nd century, later 2nd century CE. to just focus on Apollos and Nymphaeus. With Methymna, this feels like a sort of more experimental thing. I mean, it's not even the most important thing they do on their coinage at that time. And there are as many coins showing Arion of Methymna as there are Dionysos Phallen. So they're showing some attention to it at all, but not even the most. And the other thing to mention there is both of these Dionysos Phallen and the Arion of Methymna coins from the imperial period are on a much smaller denomination. So normally when a city wants to go on a bit about an important tradition or whatever, they produce these sort of medallion-like coins, which are, 25 to 45 mil, really heavy in your hand. These are more like 15 millimeters across. They're quite small. They're probably only. That was interesting. That even at the point at which Methymna does pay some attention, it's still part of and actually at that point they do put Dionysus on a lot of their other larger coins, but not represented like this cult statue. So,
Hi, that was wonderful. I was actually just struck by something you said at the end of your talk about the similarities between these cults as opposed to cults on the mainland. And I was wondering if there's any evidence that this would maybe reflect either a substrate of either a localized version of Dionysus or some other cognate or some other god that's cognate or not assimilated to Dionysus all that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly what the Greek religion people want to think, is that it all goes back to some kind of later thing. I suppose what's interesting to me is that aspects of it can be paralleled with places quite far away. So I was really struck by how closely analogous the Hermes Perforeus story is to the Dionysus Phallen one. But it's two completely different gods, two cities which are kind of connected to one another, but like not really. And equally, cult objects of this sort are a thing that turns up, and there are other examples in Greek religion. Unfortunately, noticing all of this was something that came quite late in writing the paper, so I haven't done my homework on this. But what did strike me as really odd is that all of the cults on a single island should have so much overlap when I did have a quick look using the so all Roman provincial coinage is now in a searchable online database run from the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, and so I had a quick look through province of Asia, cults of Dionysus, what have we got? And there's nothing remotely similar. So it's actually, as much as I spend a lot of my scholarly career talking about connections between Lesbos and the mainland, this is one of these times when there just isn't one. But yeah, it's definitely, I do need to think more seriously about like where does it come from, because there are some, Dionysus does come up, cults of Dionysus do, so Alcaeus, when he's talking about being, he's run away from Mytilene and he's in the late 7th century at Messon, and he mentions who the gods, the triad of gods, and one of them is like flesh-eating Dionysus. And I was like, who the hell is this? There is some sort of deeper story there, but I'm not quite sure what it is yet.
Yeah, so this is kind of related to Ethan's question as well, so it's fascinating. I was really struck by your section at the beginning where you were talking about the geography of the island and how that affects the religion and the urban cooperation or lack thereof. And I was going to ask if Lesbos' proximity to Asia Minor has any effects that you can see on the cult of stuff, but I feel like maybe you kind of answered that with Ethan's question.
With other cults, there are connections. It's just with this one there isn't. So, for example, I mean, there's the cities Erissos use coins which show the Telesphoros, which is weird, like I don't really know how to describe it. It's kind of like hooded dwarf figure who stands on the back of these things and turns up on coins in the imperial period throughout Asia Minor, and also turns up on some coins of islands close by, and Lesbos is an example. So that's like, okay, great, they're involved in that. Likewise, Mytilene has a very important cult of Asclepius. One of the most important centers of Asclepius is Pergamon, which is a very short distance away. It's probably not an accident. So there are definitely connections. And I suppose, yeah, what's interesting in this case is that that's not what you see. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Really interesting. I was wondering two things you kind of touched on already, but circulation patterns. So where are we actually finding these coins? And of course, the question of economic exchange, which filters down into, you kind of already talked about this briefly, but you know, like who are actually seeing these coins? You gave us that really great graph with the bronze and the silver, and of course, the bronze, the totally different quote-unquote audience than the silver would have. So I'm wondering, like, when you factor that in, so you know, are they advertising to themselves? We're the best Dionysus.
Yeah.
You know?
So, yeah, so insofar as there is information on that sort of information is like not readily available, even though it does probably exist. I think if the effort would let me have a look at what they have in their basement, I would discover all sorts of interesting things. I would likewise be very interested to know what coin finds they get from Antissa, for example. But you know, that information isn't available. We do have some hoards of bronze coinage from the Hellenistic period from Lesbos, but they don't really tell us anything because they're not mixed. So you're not learning that much about circulation. One of the things which is potentially interesting is in the imperial period, there's a lot of countermarking going on. So this is when a state stamps a small image onto a coin already in circulation to revalidate it for circulation in its territory. And so this can be really, as you can imagine, really great evidence for what's going on in terms of circulation and so on. And for a while, I thought this was really interesting because I'd noticed that the koinon of the lesbians produces coins in the imperial period, and that these had all of the only countermarks these had were countermarks of Mytilene. And then it dawned on me what this meant was that probably the koinon of the lesbians doesn't actually represent the whole of Lesbos at that time. It's just been nabbed by Mytilene. And that's why it's pretending to be coinage of the lesbians, but actually it's not. It's just Mytilenean coinage. So it doesn't tell you anything about circulation, but it is interesting for other reasons. So yeah, so for the bronze, I mean, some of this stuff is definitely circulating further afield, but I've not sort of systematically looked into that. For the silver, it depends on the denominations. So all of this is fairly small silver. I don't think it probably went that far afield. These are so Alexander type coins. What that means is after Alexander's death, people who wanted to produce coins that would be internationally accepted just used the types of Alexander's coinage, even though they were not the Macedonian kingdom. And so when you see Alexander type tetradrams, you know that this is coins usually for military expenditure, which would travel very far. And sure enough, almost all of the hoards for these coins are either in Asia Minor or Syria. Likewise, you know, the coin that I showed you in great depth, those have all turned up in hoards from Syria or Iraq. But that's telling you more about silver flows to the Near East than I think anything else. So slightly unsatisfying answer.
It is interesting what you point out that the Methymnians are going to seem to issue bronze with Dionysus. That is making a statement among themselves that
Yeah.
it matters that we won the Antissa back in the day, right? Even if they don't want to advertise it outside, but at the local level, our local elites are happy to tell you people of our city. That we won.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, in a way, if the audiences that you're talking to are mainly other people on Lesbos, it's enough for it to be circulating in your own territory, because all the people from Methymna come over and start trying to, pay for a loaf of bread or whatever, and they're like, "What's this?" Or equally, the former Antisans who are now members of Methymna, who are seeing they're like, oh, well, their ancestral cult turning up on Methymna's coinage very briefly, and then seeing this other Dionysus cult being celebrated there, they're also going to notice it. But I think, that's quite a different dynamic. With Alexandria Troas, it looks like that was usually the cities that it incorporated agreed to be incorporated. And what the city is doing by using a lot of the old types of the former states that it's incorporated is kind of creating hyphenated identities for them. So it's like, we're not going to ignore the fact that you were from Hamaxitus. That's now going to be a core part of what we do. And so you can be an Alexandrian Hamaxitan. I don't get the sense that that's what's happening with Antissa and Methymna. It does feel like Antissa is definitely kind of subsumed in that relationship and then kind of wiped away.
Going back to the literary evidence, specifically, you have Pausanias and Mouse were writing around the time of this shift, and Pausanias very clearly sees this statue, this copy. And it's interesting to me now, having gone back to see the coinage and the fact that originally belonged to Antissa, but then you have Theodoric who's quoting the Delphic Oracle,
which he's found in Eusebius.
Eusebius, and referring back to Methymna. So is he? I don't know how I want to phrase this, but it seems to me then that there is one who's either completely making this up, or Eusebius this up, this oracle, or was it that an oracle may have been available that mentions Methymna, and they are bringing this story to the Delphic Oracle 400 years after that?
So I think the oracle. Well, quite. So I think what we have to. So first, an observation about that oracle. So it's beginning with Allah, but which implies that there is something before, and then they've only cut out 2 lines of this oracle which say it's Methymna, and so on. So either Eusebius or more likely, or Inamalis have edited what they were looking at. Inamalis and Pausanias have enough overlap on this that there is some lost source who I'm assuming is a local historian of Methymna who has produced this account, and that would be the person who's done a bit of verse comp and come up with the oracle, for which there are many examples. But what I would like to know is at what point that's occurred.
Yeah.
And that's the bit that I can't see a way of finding out at the moment. So by contrast, in that case with Alexandria Troas, because the epithet is in Homer, all the Homeric commentators have to have an opinion on what this epithet means. Therefore, they have systematically cited a local historian from neighboring Ilion who probably went to the Smintheon, found out what the traditions were, and wrote it down. And a slightly bastardized version of that has survived in a Homeric commentary tradition. And then we're able to actually tie that together with the repertoire of images on Alexandria's coinage when they do this in 2nd century. Bingo. There we can be sure this is Hellenistic scholarship from the 2nd century BC that has come all the way through. That's what I would like to be able to do here. And I think it's probably something like that, but we don't have it. And so that's, yeah, there isn't that like kind of key piece of evidence that allows you to make the connection with a particular author or something like that. But I think that's a model for what you would expect to be happening. Yeah.
So maybe other questions, but I want to tell people that we're going to work with your draft and this can be add drinks. For now, we'd like to close the formal part of our meeting by thanking our speaker for a really evocative, rich paper, and thank our audience for being with us both in this room and online. And just a matter of events to come. We continue next week with a talk by Dr. Dimitriou from the University of Manchester, who's going to bring us the very modern era in a very different context. Dr. Dimitriou just published a new book with Kevin Featherstone, longtime head of the Hellenic Observatory at the LSE, titled Greek Prime Ministers in the Eye of Storm, Crisis Management and Institutional Change. So post-financial crisis and financial crisis stuff, that's uplifting. And the talk will very much engage with some themes of this book. Additionally, just since it's less than a month from us, October 3rd, at the Greek Community Center on our Bureaus, we have Capella Romana coming in for a performance of basically Byzantine music. Capella Romana, internationally known, they're pretty awesome. It's great for students with an ID. So no excuses for not making the schlep through that part of Vancouver. And again, Naren, thank you so much for a wonderful talk. To next week.